Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our C2ES webinar on resilient infrastructure for a secure future. I am Kristiane Huber, and I'm the Resilience Fellow at C2ES. Next slide, please. For those not familiar with C2ES, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that brings diverse interests together to find solutions to our climate and energy challenges. We believe it's vital for states, cities, and businesses to work together, now more than ever, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, deploy clean energy, and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. On the last point, resilience has come to mean different things to different groups. We define climate resilience as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to trends, disturbances, or hazardous events related to climate. Improving climate resilience involves assessing how climate change will create new or alter current climate-related risks, and taking steps to better address those risks. In today's webinar, we'll be focusing on how infrastructure projects can make the United States more resilient to climate impacts. You'll be hearing more about the cost of deteriorating infrastructure from our next speaker, but I wanted to highlight some climate impacts and what's at stake if we fail to sufficiently upgrade and repair infrastructure. In 2017, the United States experienced 16 natural disasters that caused more than $1 billion in damages each, resulting in a record-breaking cumulative cost of over $300 billion for the entire year. While 2017 was clearly an extreme year, the U.S. has been and continues to experience a growing number of billion-dollar disasters over time. From 1980 to 2016, there was an average of $5.8 billion events per year. But for the most recent 5 years, from 2013 to 2017, the annual average was 11.6 events per year. The recently published Climate Science Special Report indicates that in the next century, we can expect more extreme weather and record-breaking years. Global sea level rise is causing accelerated incidences of daily tidal flooding along the Atlantic coast, and the frequency and intensity of extreme heat and heavy precipitation is also increasing. As we all know, many parts of the country are rebuilding infrastructure damaged by recent extreme weather, along with the upgrades and repairs that are already needed. And there's real opportunity for new, repaired, and rebuilt infrastructure to be cognizant of climate impacts. This highlights the necessity for building resilient infrastructure to extend the service life of projects and to avoid future damages in a changing climate. In the coming days, the Trump administration is expected to release its long-awaited infrastructure plan. And there's bipartisan interest across the United States in repairing and modernizing infrastructure. Here at C2ES, we think it's critical those projects are designed to be resilient and help communities they serve to be more resilient in a changing climate. C2ES has published a paper just today making the case for Congress to adopt 3 high-level criteria as part of funding for any infrastructure project. Federal investment in infrastructure projects should rely on sound science and risk management principles, prioritize flexible and adaptable projects like green infrastructure, and distribute the benefits of infrastructure investment equitably. The paper also includes some examples of resilient infrastructure projects to prioritize and opportunities to modify existing infrastructure policy to enhance resilience. To read the paper and learn more about C2ES's resilience program, please check out our website, c2es.org. And we have the paper's URL in the slide, and I believe it was also chatted to all of the attendees of this webinar. So today we're fortunate to be joined by 2 terrific speakers. The first is Brian Pallasch, who's currently the Managing Director of Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers, or ASCE. Brian is responsible for managing ASCE's Government Relations Department and strategic initiative regarding infrastructure, including development of their infrastructure report card. Brian will give us an overview of the ASCE infrastructure report card. Brian will be followed by Josh Sawislak. Josh is the Global Director of Resilience at AECOM, a global design, engineering, construction, and management firm. Josh works across the entire enterprise of AECOM's offerings in planning, design, construction, finance, operations, and development. He develops and leverages resilience strategies and projects to address issues such as sustainability, climate change, disaster preparedness, and enterprise risk management. Before joining AECOM, he served as the Associate Director for Climate Preparedness in the White House Council on Environmental Quality. There will be time for Q&A toward the end of the webinar, But if anyone listening in has any pertinent or clarifying questions for each speaker, please feel free to type those questions into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And we'll try to answer them at the very end of the presentations. During the Q&A, we will also be taking questions that way. Also, we will be recording this webinar, and it will be made available on our website. So with that, I'll hand it over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Kristiane. I appreciate being here today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss an issue that's increasingly dominating the news feed, I hope, which is the need to invest in America's infrastructure. ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, is the oldest national engineering society and represents over 150,000 engineers who serve as the stewards of the nation's infrastructure, not only here in the United States, but actually around the globe. Every 4 years, since 1998, ASCE has prepared a comprehensive assessment of the nation's 16 infrastructure categories in its infrastructure report card. We use a very simple A through F school report card format. And where I live in Fairfax County, we ended the first semester of school today, so my children are nervously awaiting their report cards. Hopefully they're better than this report card. Our report card examines current infrastructure conditions and needs, assigning grades and making recommendations to raise those grades. How does ASCE actually determine the grades? We have a committee of 30 civil engineers who volunteer their time and expertise across the report card's 16 categories. They work with our staff and review relevant reports and data. We hold meetings with federal agencies and other interested parties, industry experts, to assess each category according to the following 8 criteria. The first is capacity. How is that infrastructure able to manage the current needs that it's experiencing now? The condition of the infrastructure, the funding as it stands today, the future need, and that includes not only the future need for the asset, meaning do we need more infrastructure, less infrastructure, is it overburdened, is it congested, but also what the future need is for funding. Operations and maintenance is a category. Public safety, resilience, which obviously we're here to talk about today, and last but not least, innovation. So those are the 8 different criteria that make up our grading scale, if you will. Upon determining the grades in the 16 categories, those grades are averaged just like on a school report card to determine the overall grade for the nation. Needless to say, since ASCE's first report card way back in 1998, the grades have not been one that would make a parent proud. And in fact, the nation has yet to get an overall grade. Our GPA has not risen out of the D range. Next slide, please. That remains true in the 2017 infrastructure report card, where America's cumulative GPA is once again a D+. That cumulative GPA of a D+ reflects the significant backlog of needs facing our nation's infrastructure writ large, particularly in the 3 categories that experienced a decline in this year's report card, or last year's report card: parks, solid waste, and especially transit. That was the lowest report card grade with a D-. 6 of the categories remained unchanged from the 2013 report card: aviation, bridges, dams, drinking water, energy, roads, with all but bridges stalled in the Ds. Yet there are signs of some progress. 7 categories actually saw some slight improvement, with hazardous waste, inland waterways, levees, ports, rail, schools, and wastewater inching up a little bit from their 2013 grades. Where we see areas of infrastructure that improved, those areas clearly benefited from a couple of different things. One is leadership. We saw in many of the categories that there was leadership at the federal, state, or local level that was allowing public officials and the local and local citizens to make decisions that were allowing them to improve their infrastructure. That's done, generally speaking, as part of thoughtful policy making, which is one of the other areas we saw where we had some thoughtful policy making, there were actually improvements in grades. And then last but not least, it's probably not too shocking that where there were some significant investments made, we actually saw results. Where we are spending money on improving our infrastructure, we're actually being able to see those results in real time, if you will. A quick look at the highest and lowest grades. Rail is the highest grade in the report card. It actually rose from a C+ in 2013 all the way to a B. As many of you know, the private freight rail industry owns the majority of the nation's rail infrastructure and has made significant investments in recent years to meet current and future needs and to accommodate changing cargo trends. In 2015 alone, $27 billion was invested by the freight rail industry. This investment over a course of a number of years, and the average really has been over the last 10 years, about $20 billion a year has been invested on average, has allowed for that increasing grade. However, the U.S. rail industry still faces some clear challenges, particularly on the passenger rail side, including addressing increasingly congested corridors, meeting safety technology demands, replacing 100-year-old bridges, and improving rail interconnections with other aspects of the freight network to make it a more efficient system. Transit actually received the lowest grade on the report card, as I said earlier, with a grade of a D-. That's a drop from 2013 when transit was at a D. Transit it's sort of a yin and a yang, if you will. We have some significant successes in the transit area. We have some of the highest ridership that we've ever had. You've got systems in Los Angeles and Seattle and Phoenix that are building out their system, and there's a lot of new interest in transit in some of those areas. And then we're also faced with transit in places like Washington, D.C., and Chicago and San Francisco and New York and Boston, which is those systems are struggling from significant capital backlogs. And at the time we did the report card, the infrastructure backlog for the next 10 years was expected to be about $90 billion. I'll admit, I think we may have to go back and reassess that as we move forward. I was listening to someone talk about the New York Transit infrastructure capital backlog for their transit, the MTA system, and the mayor, I think, said it was $100 billion. Now he didn't give a time frame, so that may be out a few more further years than that. But it is an area where we do need significant investment, and it did garner that lowest grade. Next slide, please. The grades in these 16 categories are obviously cause for concern and reflect the fact that America's infrastructure bill is long overdue. And in fact, when we were researching the report card last year, one of the folks we spoke to talked about the fact that America has taken a generational vacation from investing in our infrastructure. And I think that's an apt way to put it. And this chart in front of you shows the significant needs we have to make in infrastructure. In addition to the grades that we put forward, we put this chart together every 4 years, which tries to detail what we think are the capital needs of the nation's infrastructure looking out 10 years. And I'm not going to go through each of these numbers, but just note that the number in the bottom right corner is the fact that the infrastructure funding gap, or we like to call it the deficit, is $2 trillion over the next 10 years. There are needs in every single category. You can see the largest need is in surface transportation. And with that, I'll take the next slide. The other thing we've been able to do as we've looked at the needs of the nation's infrastructure is try to better understand how the infrastructure interacts with our economy, and how that infrastructure, if it's not working well, what the effect is on the economy. And what we found is that failing to close our infrastructure investment gap actually brings serious economic consequences. We did an economic study that we released in 2016 called our Failure to Act study. It was the second time we've done this. And what we found is if we don't address this infrastructure gap, the cost to the economy is sort of borne out by those three numbers on the slide in front of you. $3.9 trillion in U.S. GDP is going to be lost by the year 2025. That means our economy is simply not going to grow, which is frustrating. Businesses will lose $7 trillion in sales and other effects by the year 2025. In that year 2025, we'll lose up to 2.5 million jobs because of the underperforming, as I like to call it, infrastructure. And then last but not least, that number, the cost to families. Each American family is already losing about $3,400 on average every year in disposable income. That's more than $9 a day due to the poor infrastructure. That's income we could be spending or saving on things that would make our lives better. But instead, we're spending it on car repairs, wasted time and gas, and the increased cost for goods because the shipping system, the goods movement system doesn't work as effectively as it could. However, if you look back on the slide on the previous page, to solve it, we need to find about $2 trillion, which would be about $4 a day from the average American family. That's the price of a nice cup of coffee, and we can solve this. So what do we do about the poor state of the nation's infrastructure and this widening investment gap? Well, we have our three solutions on the next slide. And I'm not going to spend too much time on all of them, but just to say that obviously investment remains a significant problem. We do need to spend more money on investing in our infrastructure. We'd suggest as a general rule that we focus on trying to increase the amount we're investing from 2.5% of our GDP, which has sort of been the average of the last couple of years, moving that to 3.5% of GDP, and that's from all levels of government. The second area of solution, if you will, is leadership and planning. Smart investment's only going to be possible with leadership, planning, and a clear vision for our nation's infrastructure. Leaders from all levels of government and the private sector must come together to ensure all investments are spent wisely, prioritizing projects with critical benefits to the economy and public health and safety and the quality of life, while also planning for the cost of building, operating, and maintaining that infrastructure for its entire lifespan. And then last but not least, next slide, is preparing for the future, which is the reason why we're all here talking about this subject matter today. The reality is, if we're going to spend this money to invest in our nation's infrastructure, we have to do so in a more resilient and sustainable fashion. We have to develop community resilience programs. We have to look at emerging technologies and shifting social and economic trends. When we're trying to figure out what type of infrastructure we need to think long and hard about how we're going to use our land and improve that land use planning. And then finally, support research and development into new and innovative technologies, materials, and processes to be able to modernize and extend the life of the infrastructure and expedite repairs or replacement of that infrastructure. Next slide. As we've looked towards the President's infrastructure plan, we've put together a series, and I'm not going to go through these, you can see them on the screen, of what we think the President's infrastructure plan should focus on. And the reality is we need to pick projects or focus the investments on those things that are going to provide substantial long-term benefits, not only to the public and the public health and safety, but also to the economy. We feel very strongly that if we're going to be rebuilding these projects, we need to take the total life cycle cost of those projects into account. We can't be building for the lowest possible cost if that lowest cost is going to necessitate us spending a lot of money on operations and maintenance in the out years of that infrastructure asset. Obviously, going back to this theme of sustainability and resilience, that the projects need to be built in those fashions. And then finally, whatever investment we're going to get from the federal government, which we think should be an increase, the federal government needs to step up and spend some more money on infrastructure investment. It should leverage state, local, and private investment and not replace those sources of funding, but be additive to it. Next slide. The opportunity exists right now to make good on these recommendations and to solve our nation's infrastructure crisis. The Trump administration is seemingly days, if not just a couple weeks away from introducing their infrastructure plan, and we would urge Congress to weigh in and take that infrastructure plan up and put its own 2 cents to it and work with those of us in the infrastructure community to ensure that we can rebuild the nation's infrastructure as quickly as possible and as efficiently and effectively as possible. Every day that we delay escalates our shared costs and jeopardizes our health and risks our security, an option our country, economy, and communities can no longer afford. So with that, you've got the website there, and we can go to the next slide, which is simply the thank you slide. I look forward to hearing some questions and continuing this discussion with everyone on the webinar.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was really interesting and really nice to hear a little more of the story behind the report card. We got in a few clarifying questions, but I want to just ask you a couple that came up about methodology. One of them was asking how the criteria are developed for the grades, if it's comparing America to other countries, and what those standards are that results in so many sectors getting D's and F's.
So we're generally speaking, we're not comparing against other countries, mainly because we don't have the ability probably to do that. It's basically the goal is, and I left the slide out. I can certainly get you a slide that explains it. Basically, what we're trying to see is, is the infrastructure adequately performing for its intended purpose? And it's really over the larger. It's really looking at all of the infrastructure. And so, for example, if you're looking at water infrastructure, and you know that we have 240,000 water main breaks every year, maybe that's too many. Now, maybe there's some areas where there's very few water main breaks. We certainly have state and local report cards where some of the grades are a little bit higher, although we do try to apply this methodology throughout the entire process. We're also relying primarily on federal government reports, and I will acknowledge some of the flaws in those reports because they are sometimes only as good as the inputs that are given those reports by whether it's utilities or whether it's state agencies who are supposed to send those data points on to the federal government. I think I got that question answered.
Yeah, thank you. And I have one more sort of methodology question. Your presentation included estimates of economic losses due to the delayed infrastructure projects and the disrepair. There was a question, and you don't have to dig in too much, but about how those estimates were developed and what the assumptions are in that.
Say that one more time, I'm sorry.
Your presentation included some estimates of economic losses due to the delayed repair, and there was just a question about how those were developed and what assumptions are in those estimates.
So the economist that did this is an economic group called the EDR Group. They're located in Boston, and they use an economic modeling tool. And if you go to the economic study, there's some detail on both of the models that are used. So if you go to the report card website, and if I try to explain it, since I'm not an economist, I will absolutely butcher it. But on the report card website, if you go to the economic study reports, we've got some footnotes and appendices that explain fully what the modeling that is used.
Great, thank you. All right, well, with that, I think we'll move on to Josh's presentation. Thank you very much, Brian, and stay on the line for some questions toward the end of the webinar. And yeah, thanks for your overview of the challenges and of the state of infrastructure. So next up is Josh to talk more about resilient infrastructure.
Thanks, Kristiane. Great to be here. Always fun to work with CTUS and our good friends at ASCE. There's a great partnership between AECOM and ASCE. As Kristiane mentioned, We're a big infrastructure services company. We have about 90,000 people working in over 150 countries on 7 continents. So we're global in nature, but we're working in a lot of people's backyards. As Brian discussed, we have a lot of work to do based on the grades in the U.S. And the $2 trillion in work that we need to do to get it to a state of good repair. So in the next few minutes, I really want to talk about 4 things, and then we get to the fun part of the discussion where we get to really have a discussion. I want to cover some global risks, kind of an assessment of that. I want to talk about the value of mitigating those risks pre-disaster. Brian talked a little bit about the value, the cost of inaction. I want to talk about the value of action. And then I want to talk a little bit about a report that we just released earlier this week on the future of infrastructure. And then I'm going to leave you with a frame around how we look at infrastructure resilience. But let's start on a global scale. You can go to the next slide, Jason. It's probably hard to see the detail on this slide. So the good news is you actually don't need to look at it. All you need to do is look at the colors. And this is from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report for 2018 that was released about a week ago. And what's interesting about this to me, when we look at global risks, and they do a matrix, and we'll see in a second kind of how they plot risks against likelihood and impact. But what's interesting about this, because it's over time, so the left side of this chart, starting in 2005, coming through the current report in 2018, the different types of risks that were looked at from the global community as the most likely and impactful risks. And on the left side of this chart, they're mostly economic and geopolitical risks. And as you get to the right side, they get a lot greener, which are the environmental and the purple, the technological risks. So things like climate and cyber are now becoming the really important things that we see comprehensively as the risks that we're facing globally. Next slide, please. So let's talk about climate change as a driver risk. And I mentioned a second ago that there's this matrix. And if you look at this matrix, you have impact and likelihood. So that upper right-hand quadrant are the things that are above average in likelihood and are above average in impact. And 8 of the risks fall into that category. 7 of them are directly or indirectly tied to climate change. And the 8th one is cybersecurity. So we're really looking at the core in this idea of what's impacting our economic livelihood, our communities, our safety, our health. These are those risks. Failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, cybersecurity, natural disaster, extreme weather. These are the things, water crises. They're all kind of connected together, but they're all up in that upper right-hand quadrant, and those are the things that we really have to worry about. Let's go to the next slide. So this is an interesting graphic because it really looks at how they're connected. What are the drivers that are tying them together? And the interdependency, the cascading effects. These are things that move the needle. And when you start to look at the failure of climate change mitigation, the one in the middle, in the red, large-scale involuntary migration, we know that environmental and climate risks are a driver of that. We're seeing it in places like Syria, where there's a connection between climate change, the civil war, and the involuntary migration of refugees into Europe. Profound social instability, again, where there's not the ability for people to effectively live their life from a health perspective or from an economic perspective or from a geopolitical perspective. That causes these things, and they're all kind of tied together. So drought and climate change, conflict, migration. We're going to see more and more of this as these systems become less stable. Let's go to the next slide. So 2017 was a bad year for disasters in the U.S. I think Kristiane mentioned it. I've got a fancy graphic, which I borrowed from my friends at NOAA. And when you look at this and you start to understand that this is not just, oh, there was, Hurricane Harvey or Maria. There's all these different things that are all affecting the costs that we face and the threats to our infrastructure. From fiscal year 06 to fiscal year 15, that 10-year period, the U.S. government spent about $300 billion on recovery from extreme weather and wildland fire. In 2017, we had $300 billion plus in actual damages from these large disasters based on extreme weather and climate. And while the numbers aren't really comparable, it's not, because the federal government's not responsible for all $300 billion, they won't spend that much. They're going to spend a big piece of it, and we're starting to see that. So it's not, it's not going to be a tenth of that, which is what we saw in that previous 10-year period. It's really going to increase. And, 2017 may be an outlier, but we are seeing more and more of this over time. If you look at the way that the data play out, we're seeing more and more of it. And we have to start to focus on how do we address these things before they happen, because we're not really going to be able to afford to keep coming in after the disaster and cleaning up the mess. It's just becoming more and more expensive. Jason, let's go to the next slide. So Brian talked a little bit about the cost of inaction on infrastructure. And let me talk for a second about the benefits of investment. And this is a report that was released in December. It's an interim report, but there's a fair amount of detail in it. And from the National Institute of Building Sciences. This is the follow-up to a study they did in 2005. A lot of folks have probably heard this number that gets bantered around a lot about every dollar invested pre-disaster is worth $4 on the back end. This is a redo of the study in 2005, an update of the study in 2005 that came up with that. The new number is 6 to 1. And I'm going to caveat that a little bit by saying what they looked at was federal investment, and they broke it out by different types of disasters. And they did that analysis for the benefit cost ratio. And you can see in the chart for riverine flooding, it's a little bit higher, for earthquakes and wildfires a little bit lower. What we have to understand is that this is a really valuable investment. And if we spend the money before the disaster, if we prepare, if we become more resilient, we are going to get the value many times over. And this is just the cost of the recovery. This does not actually go into the things like the loss of function, the overall loss of what happens if a hospital is not available after a disaster, the personal and human cost of that. And so it's really important to understand that this is a good deal, that these investments make sense. But let me talk for a second about the second column. I guess it's actually the third column of the chart in the middle, which is if you just raise the building code to a level above what the International Commercial Code and International Building Code, the model codes that are developed, if you raise the building code up above that, you get this huge benefit, overall 4 to 1, but in hurricane surge it's 7 to 1, in riverine flooding 5 to 1. That value, that benefit cost ratio of doing that, this is not a direct investment from the government. This is a requirement that you actually design to the model code or above that model code that brings in the latest science and the latest engineering. And When we developed the Hurricane Sandy Task Force report, one of the recommendations from the President's task force was that municipalities adopt and enforce, I'm going to say that again, adopt and enforce the latest version of the model building codes. The codes are produced every 3 years, and then they go out to the jurisdictions who have to actually adopt those codes. And they can change them a little bit. They can make them stronger. In some cases, they take some stuff out of them. But they can adapt them to the specifics of that jurisdiction. What we found was that there were many jurisdictions that were not even on the, not only were they not on the current version, they might not even be on the version before that or the version before that. Some of them were 3 cycles behind on adopting code. And it's a political process that generally includes the legislature or the city council to actually adopt those codes. But it's really important because every time those codes are adopted, every 3-year cycle, there's new science, new engineering that go into those codes. And it's important to have that so that you're creating that level playing field for building. This is a key piece of how we can become more resilient. And so I recommend that you take a look at this report. It's on the NIBS website. I don't think I have the URL up there, but it's nibs.org, pretty easy to find. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about this global research report that we just released. So on Tuesday, at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, we rolled out this report. I'll give you the URL for the whole report and the piece that I'm going to talk a little bit about at the end in a second. But let me talk about the kind of top level findings, and then I'll come back and really talk about how we move towards a safe, secure, and resilient future. Next slide. So to create this report, we went out and talked to about 500 industry decision makers across the globe. Some of them had global responsibility. Some of them were focused at the national, regional, or local level. And 2 statistics that I put on this slide. One is that 82%, the vast majority of these 500 people, believe that infrastructure investments are crucial to national prosperity. And that's something that, we understand this is a huge driver in how we do this. And that only 16% think that we're actually evolving fast enough to meet the changing needs. So put that together with Brian's data on, at least in the US, where we are on the scorecard. So there's this infrastructure gap, and we're not moving fast enough. So the combination of those 2 things means not only are we behind, but we've really got to soup this up in order to move forward. And we have to focus on this because it is so critical to how we become a prosperous world. Next slide. A few more key messages. Just under 30% of the respondents cite a lack of public funding as a key reason that infrastructure is not meeting society's needs. Now, in parts of the world, a lot of the infrastructure is publicly owned and publicly financed, so balance that with the US where there's both public and private. What's, I think, important about this is not that we have to fund all of the infrastructure from a public perspective or that the private, we should privatize everything. It's going to take a balance. And I think the administration's proposal to take a P3 approach, talks about that balance, and hopefully it will incorporate a lot of leverage, not just, we're going to privatize all this infrastructure. We're going to look at how we can effectively use both public and private money. There's a $94 trillion gap to reach the infrastructure needs by 2040. That's a really critical thing. That's the G20's global infrastructure hubs assessment. If you like McKinsey's number, I think it's 70 trillion, or OECD's number is 100 trillion. But these are big numbers, and we have to focus on this. We can't really afford the costs of inaction any longer. The congested roads, the unreliable rail, the power outages, drought, flooding, cyber attacks, all cost us as individuals billions of dollars every year. So we've got to leap ahead. And I think that's really the case, is that we have to look for these things that allow us to leap ahead. And we're not there yet. We're not changing fast enough. The World Economic Forum said we stand on a brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. And so those digital tools and skills are really going to help us get there. We've been looking at these as complex problems, and the physical and the digital worlds are converging. And so infrastructure is going to be an enabler, and we have this great opportunity to leapfrog ahead, but we have to focus on that, and we have to get there. Next slide, please. If you check out the report, there are 5 kind of think pieces buried in all of the data on that we got from the respondents. Shameless promotion, I co-authored one of the pieces on resilience, and that link will take you there. But let me use that piece that we did, or a piece of it, as a frame to talk about an approach to the future. Final slide. Again, I don't expect that you're going to be able to read everything, but hopefully you can read the top line numbers, because I want to run through those as this framework for what we're calling converged resilience, which is really looking at resilience from a holistic perspective that looks not only at the climate side, the non-climate disaster side, but also the cyber, digital, and physical security side, because all of these things are linked together. And the first recommendation that we make is that you have to start early. If you wait until the end and try to make this a bolt-on to your project, you're not going to get there. This resilience has to be a lens to which you look through in the project. Now, there are certain assets you have that are already built, and you're going to have to take a different approach on that. But again, you want to start early in the process, because there are lots of opportunities to make things more resilient. The second point is that resilience is a relative term. You have to be resilient to something. This is critical, because there's no absolute in resilience. You're not resilient or not resilient. You're more resilient to something or less resilient to whatever those threats are. So you have to understand the risk. You have to understand what the vulnerabilities are and what the impacts of those vulnerabilities are. And then you're going to have to make some choices. And one way to help make those choices is to prioritize, to look at the things where you have the most value, the bang for the buck. How do we optimize to see what's really important? What are those things that are going to help us meet our mission? And the thing to always remember when thinking about this is that infrastructure serves people. It's not art. Some of them, some pieces of infrastructure are really beautiful, and they have a public art component. But the main purpose of infrastructure, the reason we need to spend these trillions of dollars, is because it supports people. And that's the key piece to keep in mind when you do that. The fourth thing is this is really enterprise risk management. You got 3 choices to make. You can accept a risk. You can mitigate that risk by designing it differently, moving the asset, building a redundant asset, whatever. Or you can transfer that risk. You can buy insurance. In some cases, the government will take that risk transfer. But you have to do one of those 3 things. And if you don't, then you've accepted the risk without actually thinking about it. And so it's critical that you think about and make a purposeful decision. And the last one is look for those opportunities to enhance the resilience of assets, looking at things like the cascading effects and the interdependency and the opportunities throughout the different work that you do. How can you get co-benefits? How can you combine things, operations, assets, all sorts of stuff to do that? And so, this is the kind of top-level frame that we're using to really help people get through that process. And we work with folks across the entire life cycle of infrastructure. So, this is kind of how we think about it. And with that, I will wrap up and turn it back to Kristiane.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. That was a great overview of how resilience looks in infrastructure. And thanks also for sharing those reports from the National Institute of Building Science and AECOM. They've really added to and strengthened this call for resilience in infrastructure. So we have received a number of questions from our webinar attendees. I wanted to start off with one which is for both of you, which is about how to develop metrics for resilient infrastructure. Do either of you have thought on that? Sorry.
It's a pretty broad question. What I will tell you is that there are not simple metrics that work. There's no one size fits all in this space because infrastructure, the different types of infrastructure in the different sectors have different things that they care about, and there are different levels of importance. What we try to do is create a different approach depending on what some of the specifics of that are. So, we've recently been working with electric utilities in the U.S. on developing kind of a resilience criteria and scorecard for how they look at resilience, because it's different for power utilities based on the way that they're regulated, and these are investor-owned utilities. So I think there's no simple answer. If there is and somebody comes up with it, then they're a whole lot smarter than me, and I'm be happy to use it. But we think it's really something that has to be a little bit bespoke. It doesn't have to be bespoke for every single client, but and there are some big concepts, but I think you do have to understand the risks that you face in order to do that. Brian?
I mean, Josh, you answered it much more eloquently than I would have. I guess what I would think of it more from a risk perspective. So part of it is understanding what risks are your infrastructure is going to be up against, if you will, and utilizing tools to accommodate the risk that you. I mean, it's sort of, I think, this notional idea of you depending on what you're going to use the infrastructure asset for, you want to build that infrastructure to withstand some sort of whether it's a natural hazard, an earthquake, a hurricane, a tornado, a flood. I think that's the way we've looked at it as ASCE. We have standards that address some of those things. We've sort of started to talk more about performance-based standards as well. And I think those are the areas that we've looked at, although the idea of metrics is probably a good one as well.
Well, one of the first questions that we ask clients, and we ask this in different ways depending on who the client is what's your risk tolerance? How important is this asset to your mission? What happens if it fails? And that drives a lot of how you define the need for investment and how much risk you're willing to tolerate.
Definitely. Thanks to both of you for those responses. The next question is about natural infrastructure. So how does natural infrastructure fit into this conversation? It's also critical to national prosperity and systems that we depend on, and also is really underfunded. How about Josh, can you go first?
Sure. So that last thing that I talked about in the 5 pieces, that enhanced piece, this is critical. The co-benefits, sometimes called ecosystem service benefits of natural infrastructure, are hugely undervalued a lot of times when we're looking at investments in resilience. And part of that is because of how we have structured the benefit cost ratios and the policies. We're not really looking at what those co-benefits are and how important they are to not just quality of life, but things like property values, the economic output of a community, employment, livability directly relates to the value of the economic value in that community and prosperity. So I think it's critical that we do that. One of the things that, when we were doing the Hurricane Sandy work, and I was the infrastructure lead for the President's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. I can't remember if that was in my bio or not. There's way too much stuff in there. But was this issue of, there were lots of people who were trying to argue gray or green. And what we were trying to get people to understand is the question's not gray or green. It's how you balance the two, gray and green. Because in most cases, it's a balance of those things. There are certain things that green infrastructure is hugely valuable for, but there are other things that certain types of green infrastructure do absolutely nothing to help. And they're not the right solution for what the problem is. So you have to understand the problem, and then you have to look at what the benefits of the various options are. Brian?
Yeah, I'm not sure I could add much to that other than to say, I think sometimes we need to ensure that the regulatory environment allows for some of those green infrastructure solutions. That has not always been the case. But the idea of non-structural solutions to some of our infrastructure problems are I think that's something that we've come back around to, and I think that is something that is increasingly important.
Yeah, it was difficult for the Corps of Engineers to look at gray and green because they were different programs. Ecosystem restoration and flood risk reduction were two separate programs that were evaluated separately. And so that was a hard thing for them to do.
Right, and I'm thinking in the area of things like stormwater and CSOs type stuff with EPA, where they had trouble understanding that green infrastructure was just as valuable, and in fact saved billions of dollars for many communities if they were putting that in, and they got the other benefits of that green infrastructure.
One last thing on that, which is one of the things that from a policy perspective is, we were also trying to apply a discount rate to green infrastructure the same way you would do it to gray infrastructure. And so, gray infrastructure, a bricks and mortar, a concrete and steel asset is going to depreciate over time. A wetland appreciates over time. And so you have to look at it differently from an economic perspective.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. And we also mention green infrastructure and use of natural systems in the C2ES Resilient Infrastructure Brief because of the co-benefits that they offer and the opportunity to implement them in stages. If you're working with wetlands or with rain gardens or larger green infrastructure features, there's a little more adaptability in that. You can change them more over time or as you're implementing them and seeing different challenges or different impacts. There's more flexibility depending on where you are and what programs you have in place. So we got a few questions about engaging corporations on resilient infrastructure. This will probably be our last question, but we do expect the infrastructure plan to rely on public-private partnerships, so this will probably come up. One of the questions was about if there are ways to incentivize innovation on materials and technology for resilient infrastructure, and then also if there are models for engaging corporations on building resilient infrastructure. How about Brian? Do you have a response to that?
I mean, I think that, simply from our perspective, it seems to me like the private entities are better at engaging in resilient infrastructure, and it's probably a way overstated comment, but I just think when you're able to calculate better what your risk tolerance is, and I think sometimes private entities are better able to do that than public entities, then it becomes a little bit easier to understand the benefit of resilient infrastructure. In terms of incentivizing it, I just think just demonstrating the economic benefit. I think the year that we just faced in natural disasters in this country, the slide that Josh had up there earlier, probably tells the tale better than anything else, and that we do need to build this infrastructure to be more resilient. It's got to withstand some of these events, and it needs to be able to function more quickly after those events occur. And that should be incentive enough.
Great.
From my perspective, I totally agree with Brian. One thing that I would say about the corporate side of things is that the financial and insurance markets are starting to price this risk a little more accurately, and they're getting smarter about how to price the resilience risk for corporate assets. And that's going to drive the market, because I think the market drivers, when it starts to affect the cost of borrowing money or stockholder equity, the value of the corporation, they're going to put hard money against it. And so we're starting to see that with clients who, some in the past kind of understood the value of this from an enterprise risk management perspective. Now we're seeing more and more who are looking out at what the market is telling them, the financial market and the insurance market, and they're realizing we need to incorporate this, because these assets that we're building, whether it's public infrastructure or private infrastructure, some of them have, 50, 100-year useful life. And what happens over time is it's going to be a risk to those. So it's not just, what happens in the next 13 weeks, the next quarter. It's what happens over the life of this asset.
Great, thank you. There was another question that came in about building codes, which I think I'll direct to Josh if you could answer it pretty briefly. What are the largest obstacles for municipalities that are adopting new building codes on a consistent rolling basis, or for them to adopt those codes on a consistent rolling basis?
So in the US, it depends on what type of state they are in. There are Dillon rule states where the municipality can just do things independently. There are non-Dillon rule states. In Dillon rule states, the municipalities have to get approval of the legislature to do anything that's different from what the legislature has already approved. So Virginia is a Dillon rule state. In order for a municipality to adopt something, they've got to get that authority from the state legislature. In all cases, whether it's at the municipal level or at the state level, these become very political because they affect a lot of different industries, and there's a lot of lobbying around, whether you're going to put more restrictions or not on the building. The cost of the building may go up. But to be quite, honest, the payback is so high to all of us. And the additional cost for new construction is actually not that high. So I think it really behooves us, as we saw in the NIBS report, to put that into the building code, at least adopt the most current building code that has the most current science in it. And that is going to take you a long way. But politics is probably the answer to the question.
Thanks. Well, with that, I'm just going to thank both of our presenters again for joining us today and for answering all of these questions. And thanks also to everyone for joining us today for this webinar. Before letting everyone go, just want to draw your attention to, we have several webinars planned in the coming months, such as one on electric vehicles and environment social guidance for investors. There's more information about these upcoming webinars on our website, c2es.org. And with that, I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon. Bye.